the second Live Catholicism conference. It's so fantastic to have you all here with us and to have got such a response back. Last year, I feel that we were the only conference in town, so we did really well to get so many people coming along. So it's great to have people coming back and coming newly to be with us. And we should say good afternoon, good morning and good evening, because actually I suspect that there are people coming from all around the world. We certainly had that last year, and we have participants from all over the place. So thank you so much for being with us. My name is Avril Bajent, and I'm the chair of the Live Catholicism Conference. I'm doing research into the Live Catholicism of British teenagers.
Recording in progress.
And I keep finding that when I went to Catholic conferences, I didn't understand the theological titles of the papers. And when I went to social sciences conferences, especially in the UK, there were no other Catholics there. So it felt like there was a space for conversation, a space to bring people together, to talk about really the lives of ordinary people, ordinary Catholics around the world. So our conference last year brought together people from across the disciplines. We asked, and right at the beginning, we heard Tricia Bruce challenge us, ask us, what does it mean when Live Catholicism meets the institutional church? And what happens when this a lived concept of Catholicism meets an idealized or the institutionalized notion of Catholicism? And at the end, the final plenary, our keynote speakers, including Robert Orsi, challenged us to be more radical. And as over the year, as we've developed this notion more in conversation with lots of key people, we've just really drawn out those notions of ordinary lives, of hybridity and improvisation, hidden voices, secret histories, a real messiness around the ordinary and the lived. And this complexifies the study of Catholicism for us, but it also, we see it complexifying the disciplines it's associated with, putting the Catholic back into history, literature, human geography, psychology. And so it makes for a more complicated picture, but certainly a more interesting one. What's new from last year is that this embrace of complexity is now official church policy. When Pope Francis announced in May that the 2022 Synod on Synodality would gain an extra phase and an extra year, he opened the church to the messiness of people's lives. And over the past couple of weeks, I've been listening to Synod conversations that are virtually identical to the ones I took part in my fieldwork. This empirical turn within the life of the church itself, it needs scholars to tell these paradoxical stories and to share the kind of prophetic insights that result. So I'm so delighted. This feels like a real moment for the church, and so delighted that we can be here together at this second Live Catholicism conference. So I just really want to thank everyone who's made it happen. Brilliant organising committee and sterling backup from the Centre for Catholic Studies and the Theology Department at Durham University. The wonderful lineup of speakers that we have. So eventually someone's going to say no to me, but I'm just so lucky. I feel very fortunate that I write out to these scholars whose books I have on my shelves and they come back and say, yes, please, I'd be interested. And I'm very grateful for you for making the time. And to everybody who's participating, everybody, particularly those staying up late into the night to be with us. And a very heartfelt thank you to our tech team, because this digital space would not be possible without you. So over the next couple of days, we have this range of keynotes, short papers, a new synodality stream, a workshop on doing Live Catholicism. How do you navigate this? Very practically, just through the links on the password protected areas of the website. This webinar stream will always be live, no matter what else is going on. So if you get lost, come back to the original link, and we'll put cards up in the break showing what the next options will be. The only exception, and hopefully we've clearly marked this, is tomorrow morning in our session with Claire Watkins, where there'll be breakout rooms. So you just need the different link, the link that's actually on the web page for that. We hope this is not too confusing. Please do shout if you're lost. At least with the digital conference, you can't disappear down a winding corridor in a strange university. Fortunately, we haven't worked out how to make the bar digital, but there are plenty of other ways of interacting with the conference. You can share ideas and questions directly with the whole conference, and please do say where you're from in that kind of now traditional beginning to a Zoom chat. Please stick your names and institutions and where you're from into the chat. It's always great to know who's here. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button, which for most of you is sitting alongside the chat button at the bottom of the screen. You can also interact with the questions. So if somebody has already asked your question, you can upvote it, which will make it more likely to be asked. Also, most of the presenters have shared their email addresses on the presenter page, so do feel free to get in touch with them. And finally, if you're into your social media, we are tweeting using the hashtag #LiveCatholicism, so feel free to tweet your thoughts and share them with the wider world. So from all of us on the organising committee, thank you again and welcome to our Lived Catholicism conference. I'm now going to hand over, I think we have Matthew Guest with us, which is a great delight, Head of the Department for Theology Religion. Welcome, Matthew.
There we are. Thanks, Avril. It's fantastic. Oh, am I still muted?
Nope, you're good.
Nope. Great. I had a message saying I was muted. It's great to be welcoming you all to this second conference on Lived Catholicism. I was there for part of last year's event and can really, I couldn't be more delighted to see that this is continuing further, and that the efforts of Avril and the rest of the organising team have produced such an exciting programme of speakers. I'm head of the Department of Theology and Religion, and I'm also a sociologist of religion, and so I'm especially heartened to see such enthusiastic engagement with the lived reality of Catholic religion, something that's interested me for a long time, but not which I've been able to explore much in my own work. I hope to in the future. It's fantastic to see this happening, and I really do wish you all well in exploring the various tricky issues that you've got on the agenda over the next couple of days. Avril, you've done a fantastic job again, and I'm really delighted that this is all happening, and yet another exciting academic venture emerging from the Centre for Catholic Studies and from our own department. Welcome, everyone. I hope I'll be able to meet and speak with some of you, and do have a wonderful conference.
Thank you ever so much. It's Professor Guest, which I should have given you your official title, has just been such a support and for my own project, and just have that great support for sociology of religion, the study of religion within the department is fantastic. Thank you so much. So now we are going to get into the main meat, and such an absolute delight to have Professor Massimo Fragioli. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Marcus Pound, a colleague in the department, who is going to take us from here with this session.
Thanks, Avril. Thanks, Matt. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Massimo Fragioli, whose expertise in the fields of Catholic history and theology include the papacy, Vatican II, the Roman Curia, liturgical reform, New Catholic moments, and global politics. He's a prolific contributor to the journals Commonweal and La Croix International, and he teaches courses at Villanova on modern church history, Catholicism, and world politics and ecclesiology. He has a forthcoming book, Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States. I think that's available next year, in which he presents historical and theological context for Biden's presidency, as well as looking at the faith of the man himself. On his Twitter page, he self-identifies as a gelateria Catholic. I think that means he's a Catholic who enjoys ice cream, or he's a Catholic who considers the gelateria or the ice cream parlor as somehow key to informing our ecclesiology. Either way, it adds a humorous element, of which paradox remains the key ingredient and the subject, I believe, of his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation that allowed me to develop some thoughts, and for this very kind introduction. I see that gelateria is becoming a thing, and I'm very proud of that. But here we go about prophecy and paradox. In a turn that is difficult to locate chronologically in global Catholicism, social and political concerns have become the defining force of theological thinking. Prophetic discourse has become the dominant form of theological thinking and language for the critique of systematic injustices and for social, political, but also ecclesial and religious reform, not just from activists, but also, thanks to Pope Francis, from many church leaders. In a very important book published in 2018, theologian and legal thinker Kathleen Caveney of Boston College analyzed and demonstrated the central role of the prophetic discourse in the form of prophetic indictment for the voice of religion in a public discourse. What she calls the utopian nature of a prophetic discourse, with its radicalism that is often corrosive of communal bonds, runs in parallel with the goal of moral deliberation and is different from what she calls the deliberative discourse composed of careful arguments. Caveney writes, quote, unsurprisingly, prophetic discourse, the language of fire and strength, has far more power to shape the overall tenor of a conversation than deliberative discourse. Its emphatic and unequivocal condemnation, conjoined with its vivid language, have a disproportionate effect on the way the communication in which it is embedded is received, close quote. Two relevant examples which are central in the discourse of the Catholic Church in the public square in the last decades, of course, include abortion and torture. Caveney talks about the tension between the impatience of the prophets with, quote, the analytically nuanced description of human actions proposed by the liberators, as well as with the efforts of the liberators to identify and justify exceptional situations that warrant a departure from the general moral rule, close quote. The aim of my lecture today is to begin from Caveney's description of the tension between the prophetic and the deliberative in order to develop some reflections on the paradox and the paradoxical as a central modality of lived Catholicism, and to make an argument for the necessity of the study of lived Catholicism in order to recover the paradoxical and understand Catholicism in a more fruitful balance between the prophetic and the paradoxical. The state of our public and ecclesial discourse could gain something important from a renewed attention to the paradoxical. This is especially true for the Anglo-American space, where we see the dominance of a public and civil use of religion that sets aside the depth of the paradoxical, both on the plane of the religious faith and on the properly human one, but not only. In this, the study of lived religion is a very necessary way to preserve intellectually the religious and spiritual nature of Catholicism in this age of extreme political polarization. The paradox is a most important facet of the religious and spiritual experience, as opposed to the doxa, the popular opinion or common belief, as Cicero has already explained. Paradoxical are the things that arouse astonishment because they go against appearances. In this sense, Christian revelation is paradoxical according to what is opposed to doxa, to a previously established concept and to the expectation that is connected to it. St. Paul, in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 6, talks about the paradoxes of Christian ministry. And they're described in verses 8 to 10. Honor and dishonor, evil report and good report, deception, not truth, unknown and well-known, dying and living, chastened yet not killed, sorrowful and always rejoicing, poor and making others rich, having nothing yet possessing all things. A theology of a paradox was outlined in one of the defining texts for a Christian understanding of the relationship between faith and citizenship in human history, the letter of Diognetus, between the 2nd and 3rd century. The paradoxical character of Christian identity and praxis is that faith solicits fidelity to the heavenly city, and at the same time, a commitment also towards the earthly city. Christians experience the condition of being almost on the edge of the city in the vigilant attitude of the century. On the one hand, they take care of the city. On the other hand, they confess that they are waiting for redemption. The constitutive link that exists in believers between faith and life is paradoxical in that they understand religion in a way that, although spiritual, inextricably embraces moral attitudes that have a public impact of great importance and resonance. What characterizes Christianity is the paradoxical in this sense of Tertullian's credibile quia ineptum, and here ineptum as inconvenient, not absurd or contradictory. The paradox does not suspend, but changes the paradigm of rationality from the possible to the impossible, proposing an intelligible, rational answer to a question not formulated, not yet explicitly posed, whose rationality had not yet been conceived. This has consequences not only on the level of intelligibility, but also in the spiritual lives of Christians, as Augustine wrote in the Confessions, quote, "You love without frenzy. You are jealous yet secure. You regret without sadness. You grow angry yet remain tranquil. You alter your works, but never your plan. You take back what you find, although you never lost it." Centuries later, Blaise Pascal connected the paradoxical to the everyday messianism of our lives, where even the small actions of each day become great. Quote, "Do the little things as great because of the majesty of Jesus Christ, who does them in us and who lives our life, and large and small and well off because of his power." End quote. A thinker who has addressed the paradoxical in the 20th century, and ça va sans dire, not in a systematic way, but in form of fragments, is Henri de Lubac. De Lubac contraposed paradox and dialectics. Quote, "Paradox has more charm than dialectics. It is also more realistic and more modest, less tense and less hurried. Its function is to remind the dialectician, when each new stage is reached in the argument, that however necessary this forward movement is, no real progress has been made. As the scholars of old say, in a rather different sense, of eternal life itself, we are ever going from beginnings to beginnings. For paradox exists everywhere in reality before existing in thought. It is everywhere in permanence. It is forever reborn. The university itself, our universe in growth, is paradoxical. The synthesis of the world is not being made. As each truth becomes better known, it opens up a fresh area for paradox. Thought which failed to leave its place then, which in other worlds did not recognize this universal place that it has would be paradoxical in the bad sense. But paradox in the best sense is objectivity, end quote. De Lubac offered a powerful warning against a binary view of things. Quote, unlike dialectics, the paradoxes do not involve the clever turning of for into against. Neither are they only conditioning of the one by the other. They are the simultaneity of the one and the other. They are even something more, lacking which, moreover, they would only be vulgar contradiction. They do not sin against logic, whose laws remain inviolable, but they escape its domain, end quote. For de Lubac, the paradoxical is essential also for Christian spiritual doctrine. Quote, the gospel is full of paradoxes by which the mind is at first troubled, and it is a question at least whether all substantial spiritual doctrine must not of necessity take a paradoxical form. Paradoxical in its substance, spiritual truth is also paradoxical in its rhythm. When we discover it and hold it in our hands, we do not have time to bring our first look of satisfaction to rest upon it before it has already fled. To get hold of this elusive truth, again, we should perhaps seek it in its opposite, for it has changed its sign. But often we prefer to hug its rotten corpse, and we go rotten with it, end quote. So paradox is necessary also to recognize when truths become lies. And this may be true also for the development of doctrine, when we reach a point when some established truth in the tradition become lies. And the paradoxical has indeed escaped also ecclesiological thinking, and not just before Vatican II, but also after. Catholic theologian and historian Joe Komonchak noted in the 1990s that the ecclesiologists spent too much time propounding abstract images disconnected from the lived reality of ordinary Christians, mystery of communion, body of Christ, temple of the Spirit, etc. Komonchak called for a greater integration of the more empirical disciplines, especially that of sociology, to better understand the reality of the church and its functioning or dysfunction. Another important critique of abstract images of the church was put forward by Italian theologian Italo Mancini in his 1991 book subtitled For a Theology of Paradox. Mancini had stated before that there are three fundamental models for Christianity to be in the world: presence, mediation, and paradox. And Mancini described them in this way, quote, all of them have behind them troubled stories of thought and action. Between them, they are not always reconcilable, and my choice, the most uncomfortable, falls on the so-called Christianity form of paradox, next to or in front of or against the form of presence, the most open to worldly culture, and that the highest, and I would say almost Augustinian, called Christianity of mediation, which supposes the recognition of dignity of ideology and the reading of the analogies of eternal truths, end quote. In his book, Mancini, a revered thinker who always remained on the margins of the institutional Catholic Church in Italy, was reflecting in the context of Italian Catholicism during the pontificate of John Paul II and his culture of presence. He assessed that there was a dominance of the culture of presence, quote, where the reckoning with God takes place only on the basis of the splendor of the data or of facts, as if everything were sheltered from the condition of being being problematic. The dominance of facts or data has overshadowed the reality that God is more present in the invocation than in the demonstration. End quote. In another important recent book, American Catholic theologian Anthony Gozziba dedicated important pages to paradox in his recent A Theology of Presence and Absence of God. He talks about paradox in the phenomenality of faith. God is not seen and yet revealed. We have no direct access, yet access is given through Jesus, the Son. Gozziba points to God's discretion as the reason for the centrality of the paradox. Quote, God is not an object of knowledge the way other objects are. Our epistemological expectations are confounded. God does not impose or overwhelm, but holds back so that reality, having its foundation in God, might have space to be. The basic structure of revelation is that divine discretion is not stasis or non-action, but rather an act of giving, a granting of time to exist in order to actualize the possibilities of one's identity in relation to others and to God, end quote. Now, why is important paradox in the church of today? The paradoxical has come back to the fore of Christianity and has acquired a new place in the Catholic Church, also thanks to Pope Francis' pontificate. And paradox could be a different way to translate Pope Francis' emphasis on the so-called tension between polar opposites that shapes his spirituality, but also his philosophical and theological approach to everything. Now, we all know that a desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world. It is something that Pope Francis could have said, but actually said George Smiley in John le Carré's The Honorable Schoolboy, in a moment in the novel in which Smiley is interrogating the fieldman Sam Collins. So John le Carré was, I believe, a moralist, but also in his own unconscious way had something to say to theologians and to ecclesiologists. He understood the paradoxical aspect of belonging to institutions that require a moral commitment, but offered us also a model of unostentatious steadiness, even as those same once trusted institutions crumble around us. Le Carré was warning, I believe, against the myth of easy dualism that is desolating the church today. The illusion that there is clear blue water between the merely religious and the self-described spiritual, the corrupt and the immaculate, the unalloyed bad and the unalloyed good. Now, I don't have a past in intelligence service like John le Carré, but there are three places and moments that showed me that the danger of watching the world, and Christianity especially from a desk, is particularly serious in this cultural and political moment. And these encounters happened just as in these last 2 decades, while the Catholic Church became more and more absorbed in the culture wars, both domestic and in the global clashes of civilization. The first place is the so-called Madonna of the Tangerines, the Madonna patron saint of the thieves in that part of southern Italy, which goes back to the anti-rigorist moral theology and pastoral praxis of Alfonso Maria de Liguori in the 18th century. It is a local devotion that exemplifies, albeit unconsciously, a certain sense of the Christian idea of the paradoxical relationship between justice and mercy and the overabundance of divine mercy. But I do not recommend that you open your lecture before a convention of canon lawyers with that example, as I did a few years ago. The second example is the history of the pilgrimage of Muslims to the sanctuary of Saint Naya in Syria, which I visited in July 2001. The Greek Orthodox Church's convent of Our Lady of Saint Naya is a major pilgrimage destination 20 miles north of Damascus in Syria. It is one of the most ancient monasteries whose foundation goes back to the Emperor Justinian, and a pilgrimage site for both Christians and Muslims who visit the miraculous icon of Saint Mary, which is attributed to Saint Luke. What is most striking about the Saint Naya is that on any given night, Muslim pilgrims far outnumber Christian ones, in defiance of the boundaries reinforced by the political events and wars of the last decades, especially between a West identified with Christianity and Islam. The third place and moment is when Pope Francis, together with the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, and Archbishop of Athens and of Greece, Hieronymus II, went to the Greek island of Lesbos to meet the refugees on April 16, 2016. At the end of the day, when Francis rescued 12 Muslim refugees from that detention camp and took them to Rome on his papal flight, I surprised myself by thanking God for the extraterritoriality of the Vatican, the sovereignty of the Vatican State, and the legacy of the temporal power of the Pope. Vatican State, as we all know, is one of the fruits of the 1929 Lateran treaties with Mussolini. But at the same time, and paradoxically now, through the teaching of Pope Francis, is a bastion against the new ethno-populism that is often inspired at Vatican fascism. That's one of the examples of the paradoxical relationship between the institutional that is symbolized by the Vatican and prophetic Christianity. Now, what are the pressures against paradox in Christianity today? In the last decades, the study of lived Catholicism and of lived religious experience has greatly innovated the approach to Catholicism in a way that complements a more traditional study of the institutions of the Church, which I believe is a study that is still necessary considering the history of the Church and the self-understanding of Catholics. As an historian of church institutions and of the responses to new movements, I believe that a renewed attention to the paradoxes and to the paradoxical can benefit both the study of church institutions and of lived Catholicism, mostly in the attempt to reconcile these two approaches and save them from a mutual exclusivism. And here there are some new reasons in light of these last few years in our political, social, ecclesial climate to rediscover the paradoxical. And I just want to highlight 5 challenges against the paradox, which are also challenges to the possibility of understanding lived Catholicism. And so these are reasons that make, in my opinion, the study of lived Catholicism even more essential now, for reasons that are intellectual, but also ecclesial, in the sense of maintaining a sense of the Catholicity of Catholicism. The first challenge is epistemological. The paradox has been brushed aside, not just by the old positivism of a dominating technical scientific knowledge, but also by the new enchantment with dataism, data, and the algorithms. It is no surprise that the new masters of the universe, or I should say new masters of the metaverse, in charge of our online lives, but with deep effects on our real lives, on our lived relations with other humans and with reality, have recently developed an interest in religion and spirituality. It's an interest that is not just due to the potential audience for their products, but also due to what the virtual or the metaverse really intends it to be. Here, paradox is a defense against the idol of total transparency that the digital world insists on. Transparency is a way of establishing control, sheer violence against human persons, and a way of the privileging the different, the other, the unclear, the mysterious. The second challenge is linguistic. The church and religions live in an environment shaped by media and social media that are driven by a rhetoric of indictment, coupled with the exigencies of the market of divertissement and entertainment. Now, the paradoxical helps us in breaking the spell of detemporalized inertia and evoking the deeply rooted human capacity to surpass the constraint of an anxiety-ridden now, ever-present now. The time frame of the media and social media, the new altar of distraction, changes the sense and the language for both the eternal and of time. And to save this sense, we need more of the paradoxical. The third challenge is spiritual. The paradox can save Catholicism from the temptation of becoming a concept Christianity, an understanding of Christianity based on one particular option or brand that can be based on the experience of the culture wars, or, as we have seen lately, also a liturgical option that is a form of invention of the tradition. But without a sense and a language of the paradox, the rhetoric on identity and diversity can easily become spiritually destructive and self-destructive. The fourth challenge is theological. The emphasis on the prophecy and on the prophetical takes place often at the expense of the paradoxical. Social and political concerns have shaped contemporary theology to the point that every field of theology has become, in one way or another, political theology. Militant political theologies that are dismissive of the paradoxical often risk mutating into a political ecclesiology that has sectarian and therefore non-Catholic traits. The fifth and final challenge is ecclesiological. Henri de Lubac said that the mysteries of Jesus Christ and of the Trinity can make sense. But the mystery of the church does not make sense, or does make sense only paradoxically. This is even more true today. The collapse of the sensus ecclesiae is not just due to the scandals, the abuse crisis, financial scandals, cultural war, political alignments, but it's due also to a lack of a theology of paradox. The list of paradoxes indicated by de Lubac in his commentary on chapter 1 of the Vatican II Constitution, Lumen Gentium, is one of the greatest contribution to the hermeneutic of Vatican II under the lens of the paradox. Now, in conclusion, the reality of paradox is important because it is rooted in both the Imago Dei and in the Incarnation, which give rise to Catholicism incarnational and sacramental imagination, which in turn allows us to contemplate paradox and be comfortable participating in it. The emphasis on the prophetic at the expense of the paradoxical is also part of the Revanche de Dieu as a social critique of modernity. And this is globally, not just in Catholicism or in Christianity. This is important because this is clearly a time of disappointment, of discouragement, when it is not necessary to have a great systematic thinker or thinkers, but it's very necessary to have great spirits able to see and to keep the paradoxical. Paradox is a way to talk about the overabundance compared to what we can see. Paradoxical talks about the overabundance in face of absence, about the infinite and the unknown of death. The problem is that the paradoxical in the church today has become more complicated and pervasive, yes, less visible and less fashionable because it has become less expedient, also politically and financially. Here, the study of lived Catholicism matters because it helps to keep Catholicism free from moralistic sectarianism, which conceptually is exactly the opposite of Catholic. The study of lived Catholicism, lived in society, but lived also in institutions, matters not just because Christianity and Catholicism are deeply historical phenomena, but also because it allows us to keep the paradoxical in it. And keeping the paradoxical means continuing to see the church in history, as opposed to the church as a new kind of societas perfecta, perfect society. And here perfecta in different ways, according to different ideological ways of projecting Christianity on the basis of a certain assumption of society. Society could be for, and here society could be for the paradoxical, much less hospitable than we expect. Here, contrary to the assumption of many, the crisis of the institutional church could mean fewer free spaces for the survival of the paradoxical and of lived Catholicism. In this sense, in order to maintain some spaces for lived Catholicism, there needs to be an institutional church that has often been more patient with the paradoxical than the postmodernist, social, and prophetic Christianity of the options. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions, and to Marcus Pound for his response. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Massimo. That was a wonderful paper, a bold paper, no less. Behind it, ostensibly about paradox, but behind it, of course, this question of how lived Catholicism can considerably contribute to addressing some of the fundamental issues and diremptions or divorces that are happening within our Catholic milieu. So we've got a question and answer box, and I'm going to encourage participants now to put some of their questions in the Q&A box, and I'll go through that in a second. Whilst you're preparing your questions, I'll just, if I may, I think just provide a brief summary and open up some lines of thought. I thought, Massimo, that was an extraordinarily helpful conceptual framework for helping us explore the conference themes of paradox and prophecy. I think if I heard your argument correctly, you're concerned about the dangers of the prophetic when it can become merely transgressive and shy away from those more deliberative modes of reasoning, of which you find paradox an essential component thereof. You helpfully mapped out the role of paradox to Christian identity, drawing on the early church, but also in particular Henri de Lubac. And my sense is that his critique of neo-scholasticism, that divorce of nature and grace that he encountered, and his attempts to work paradox back into that relationship, serves as a blueprint for so much of this. You provided some really helpful lived examples of Catholicism engaging in these paradoxes. I'd love to hear what the canon lawyers thought about the devotion to feasts. But you also highlighted the Muslim pilgrims to Christian sites and Pope Francis' use of extraterritorial powers. You were able to feed those back into the theology to help us think through aspects of epistemology, linguistics, spirituality, theology, and ecclesiology in ways that should help us combat some of the binary bifurcations that we encounter within that thought. So I thought that was extraordinarily helpful. In the first instance, it reminded me of the book by Lauren Winners, writing in the Protestant tradition, The Dangers of Christian Practice, how we so often want to replicate Christianity in a form of repristination, as if so much of these problems and issues don't arise. She controversially starts that book with the prayer of a slave owner, and challenges us to sort of understand the works of charity in that, but contextualizing it within other prayers, just so that we are aware of these contradictions and paradoxes within faith. It does also invite a certain reflexivity, the category of paradox, on the researcher themselves, not just the theologian, but those secular researchers working in the field of lived Catholicism. And of course, the paradox of the researcher is always that inside-outsider paradox. We have to work in those. I'm reminded of Kierkegaard's distinction, also a lover of paradox, that on the one hand, we're paradoxical as humans by relating to the eternal conscious God. But in Christianity, there's a double paradox because we have to relate to that in time. And so it raises the question of how far we can take this paradox and how far we should take it into our reflexivity as researchers. And I suppose returning to Lubac, I think part of the reason that he wrote in such a fragmentary style was, as you suggest, looking for a style that can somehow contain paradoxes in the way that the rational theology of old couldn't always do. It might itself be an example of lived Catholicism, representing the fragmentary nature of those times during the war, etc., when it was probably a lot harder to put more concerted things together. But it does raise an overall question about the ongoing relevance of that ressourcement movement and that critique of nature and grace as it was formulated, and how far we've come with that in our own thinking in terms of Catholicity, but also its centrality to how we then approach the empirical questions. So I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of those briefly, and I'm just going to look at the Q&A questions.
Let me say one brief thing. So I'm really grateful for your remarks and for this invitation, because again, it is something I thought in this last 20 years, but never in in a way that allowed me to develop. So here, one thing I want to say, I believe that one of the challenges of the rediscovery of the paradoxical in contemporary Catholic academia intellectual conversation is that we need to consider a dangerous thing, which is allowing a certain element of witness, of personal witness of the theologian or of the thinker back into our classrooms, our lecture halls, which has been considered dangerous for a long time because it was considered dangerous as it opened space for intrusion, for surveillance. Well, now we're all surveilled. And so that should be considered. Also, one other thing. I believe that the emphasis on the prophetic has taken advantage of a particular set of biblical sources. I believe, and I strongly believe this, that we need to go back and offering more of wisdom literature, which is full of those paradoxes of this techne, of that art of living, which is not just the indictment. So here, I believe that this conference and this series of conference is very important because it really raises questions on the whole balance of doing theology, of doing research, of teaching theology in a totally different system and climate compared to just 20 years ago. Yeah. And so I am again very grateful, and I would stop here for now.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when the Catholic Church set up the Biblical Institute in Jerusalem in response to the biblical criticism coming out of Protestant circles. And of course, it was established as a defense, but as soon as you had that interaction of scholars, you know, the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. So we've got some great questions here, Massimo, which I'm just going to field to you. We've got one from Richard here, which is with reference to the Sensus Fidei. To what extent can it help us enable recognition of lived Catholic studies by open-minded researchers?
So I believe that there has been a lot of emphasis lately on the Sensus Fidei or the Sensus Fidelium in official theological, ecclesiastical documents because of the whole emphasis of Pope Francis on synodality. I believe there has been maybe less prominence given in systematic theology to the role that a fundamental sense of the faith of what we believe should be given in our considerations. And this is really some of the reasons why Pope Francis is not really an enthusiast of academic theology. So he might have a point there. And so methodologically, there is an emphasis on what is irregular or deviant when we study. But there is maybe something that is more traditional that express the Sensus Fidei, and that is a polarity that we should keep in tension, I think.
Do you think your background as a historian makes paradox easier to accept in the way that history often points to this complexity?
I do believe that. I also do believe that there's a certain role that my Italian heritage, I mean, I lived in Italy until I was 37. I spent 1 year in law enforcement, in the police, and that made me understand a few things. So there's this joke that Italians take laws as just suggestions that are not binding really. It's funny, but it's more complicated than that. So there is a continental European sense of the messiness of things and of history. Italy is not a country. It has become a country 150 years ago, but it's a whole complex of different things that stay together miraculously, or they don't stay together. But this is where I come from.
Now we've got a question here, which we've got a couple of questions around defining paradox a little bit more, but I want to ask you this one first, because it's perhaps something that we all fall prey to when we're discussing paradox over and against binary bifurcation, is to what extent do we subtly fall prey to those? The question is, could you elaborate on sectarianism as the opposite of Catholicism?
So here there is a whole literature going back to the German Wissenschaft on Christianity in the 19th and early 20th century, Max Weber and all of that, and of course Troeltsch. Now this has become very relevant in these last few decades in the United States, where I live since 2008, where there has been a push for a response to social ills and social problems. And that has created a tension between an idea of Catholicism as big tent, where different ways of looking at things must be kept together in the same frame. There is a mysterious ways in which they stay together, compared to a new approach that is more indictment based, that looks for a more defined cultural, ethical profile of Catholics. This is a real clash. So here sectarian means the tendency of some church leaders, but also some thinkers, to say in a very powerful way, the church should really look more like me or my way of thinking of the church. I go back to the history of the excommunication of communists in 1949. It never worked because it was contrary, not just to anthropology and so on, but to the very sense of how things work. And so that failure of the condemnation of communism in the sense of excommunication hasn't taught much to modern sectarians. That is what I mean by that. So there are boundaries in which, but one thing is polarities that can stay together in the church, and another thing is seeing heresies everywhere. And this is where we are now, where heresies are everywhere. And I don't think it is fruitful, but also, I mean, intellectually, I believe that there's too much accusations of heresy going around.
Yeah. I'm reminded of visiting an Italian one Easter, and he was one of the staunch communists in the village, but it didn't stop him from having a presepe in the corner of the kitchen. I did ask him, he said it was for the children. It's a striking example that you provide us, actually, this idea of you in this sort of Catholicism, where your metaphors are often taken from the Cold War. And I think when you do certain sorts of research within Catholicism, the general culture of secrecy, etc., does lend itself in some ways to aspects of that imagination. We've got a couple more questions here. One of the things that people are particularly interested in, and I think this covers a number of the questions, and is perhaps one of the more trickier ones, is, how can we put it? How is paradox different from mystery? That's one. Another asked, could you unpack paradox within spirituality? And this one from the London Jesuit Centre. I'm interested to hear more about the core concept of paradox in theology, because it can be allied with a very sort of maintenance of conceptual boundaries. Otherwise, you lose the paradox, and we just end up using paradox to describe the messiness of reality or the fuzziness, which seems a little different from paradox. So could you unpack a little bit more about the conceptual resources and how you're positioning and understanding paradox?
So these are big questions. And
I know.
So there is a difference, of course, between paradox and messiness or paradox. I believe that there is an importance of understanding of phrasing the paradox and leaving it in its place without aiming at a solution of things. Okay, so here in pastoral theology, but also so there are messiness that must be dealt with. And then there are paradoxes that must be left as they are. So this is one, if you want, practical way of looking at that. I believe, by formation, I'm not a systematic theologian, and I don't do spiritual theology, but I believe that there is a philosophical aspect of the paradoxical that is what is keeping the religious alive in our world. I believe it's one way that still speaks to us, because it really answers some deep questions that are not be answered by science or by systems or the magisterium. So here, one of my concerns is to cast the papacy or the church exclusively in prophetic terms. I believe that the major task of the church is to enable the prophetic and the paradoxical, the contradictory, to stay together. I would really be worried of a church where the ecclesial is substituted by the prophetic. I believe there is an absolute necessity of that on all the issues that we know. But it would really be one step before becoming a church that loses touch with a lot of humanity and of humankind also. So that is what I would say. It's not about solving problems. It's not about fixing things, which is our attitude on so many things. That's what I would say for now. Yeah.
I suppose a bit like the Chalcedon formulation of Christ, God is fully man, fully human. It's a paradox, and the formula is not designed to resolve the paradox. In many respects, it's designed the formulation that is designed to maintain that paradox and keep us. But I'm reminded also, thinking particularly to the Italian context and the difference between the scholastic modes of reasoning with their roots in Aristotelian logic and the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and how that fashioned a form of theology. But I'm also reminded of the vernacular writers of the late medieval period. I'm thinking of people like Jacopone de Todi, for example, where the vernacular form is appropriated, like Kierkegaard, who also wrote in the vernacular, precisely to capitalize on the way that the vernacular language could come up with jokes and paradoxes and use those tropes in ways that systematic theology always couldn't, which is another way of saying that the call for paradox as in the centrality of our thought is also a call to think far more concertedly about the way that different genres and approaches have been engaged within the life of Catholicism. And Jacopone de Todi is an interesting character because there's a question here about, in the question and panel section, let me just find it very quickly. It's about how we mobilize, or how a framework of action for the congregation of faith to take to enable paradoxical thinking. And so in other words, how do we actually sort of mobilize this? Is one of the main problems an idea of literal orthodoxy instead of idea orthodoxy, which would enable a renewed incarnate faith in an encounter with world's reality? So in other words, how do we really mobilize this role of paradox? And as again, I use that example of Jacopone de Todi because, I mean, he was quite, he was quite the performer, for example, in the way that he mobilized that. He was asked once to take some goats to a farmer's house, I think, and he took them to the graveyard. Well, that's your home. So there was a performative dimension within the way he expounded paradox to bring people in.
Right. So I think that has largely happened, especially in English-speaking context, and it's one of the merits of this field that is called Catholic Studies in different ways. So different sources in a global, but in the sense of sources discipline approach to. It is something that has not really been part of the approach of the church institutions to the problem of how to call these voices and these sources to be part of a symphonic church. I believe that this is one of the big bets of this pontificate with synodality. Is another way of saying we need to call more voices that have been unheard or neglected or silenced often by the institution. So here there is a disconnect between the intellectual world. Well, this has started already, mostly, I have to say, in the English-speaking world, and in the institutional, which operates in a different galaxy sometimes. So here I believe that lived Catholicism is meeting a particular kairos in the life of the church at this time.
Which raises an interesting question about the role of the researcher within the field of lived Catholicism and as also affecting, changing and an activism within that field. But I'm going to leave that question open. Instead, Professor Murray, are you there? We're almost...
Hello, Marcus. I can't...
Good, yes.
Oh yes, I have been able to undo my video. That's it, great. So, wow,
right, yes.
What a great start you're getting us off to, Massimo and Marcus.
So we're almost at past, and I think you're just going to give us a little 5 minutes concluding remarks before Avril joins us to announce the break.
Okay, well, it falls to me as director of the Centre for Catholic Studies here at Durham University, and as a systematic theologian. I can out myself, Massimo. I am a systematic theologian working in constructive ecclesiology, to say a few words of thanks and a reflective punctuation at the end of this first keynote address. I'm going to first start by saying a word of thanks to Avril and then to yourself, Massimo. 2020 will go down in history as a uniquely challenging year in human culture. Not, however, without some surprising and new good things emerging from it, as we, the most adaptive species on the planet, developed new ways of thinking, working, and being. And one of these good new things that emerged for us, certainly here at Durham, and judging by the way in which it's attracted interest from around the globe, has been the emergence of lived Catholicism, the explicit emergence of, a named emergence of lived Catholicism from its pupation, its time of pupation in the work of Avril Bajent. And it's coming to fly in glorious butterfly fashion amongst us, both in last year's inaugural online conference, the first Lived Catholicism online conference, and we can have assurance from the fine way in which we've started here today with you, Massimo, in this year's conference as it unfolds. Some of the background to this sense of excitement and appreciation is that we in the Centre for Catholic Studies, which is situated in a department of theology and religion, not outside, doing its own kind of discrete Catholic studies thing, we've been desiring for some years now to find a substantial way of intentionally bringing our program areas in constructive Catholic theology, in Catholic social thought and practice, and in the history of Catholicism, into sustained engagement with empirical studies of the living, breathing realities of Catholicism in its diverse global contexts. Avril Bajent's development of lived Catholicism has brought to articulation and life, and that's really important, not just the conceptualizing, articulation and life, this most wonderful vehicle for our doing this. It is at once opens up a serious academic subdiscipline, which brings together expertise across sociology, anthropology, geography, history, practical theology, political science, and many more. A subdiscipline that, as we heard from Professor Matt Guest earlier, can be recognized and respected by our peer colleagues who work in cognate areas of the study of religion. But it's also equally of great timeliness for the contemporary Catholicism outside of the academy, which is, as has been alluded to, on an accelerated course now towards relearning something of what it means, something of what it might mean, something of what it should mean to be a fully synodal church, attentive to the actual lived concerns, realities, and prayed and discerned convictions of Catholics on the ground in multiple diverse situations. Now, Massimo, you have illustrated all of this and by opening this year's conference with a set of explorations with characteristic flair and panache and fluency. You started out with a profound reflection on paradox in relation to the tension between prophetic discourse and deliberative discourse. You moved to paradox and lived Catholicism as a way beyond a binary of idealism and brute realism, beyond defensiveness and dismissiveness, of capable of moving beyond inertia and being locked into the ever-present now by evoking new possibilities and touching our imaginations, beyond the fracturing of competing concept Catholicisms and the overcoming of sectarian Catholicism. You've given us a lecture that is intellectually and academically robust, and yet also as the very area of lived Catholicism promises, is also a fresh, ecclesially and ecclesiologically vital. You remind us that true radicalism in church, theology, and study of religion is neither about extremism nor idealism, but about going to the living root and seeking with patient love to serve health in relationship, health in relationship of the ecclesial body of Christ in relation to its actual lived realities, both its suffering and joys, its wounds and wonders. As a systematic theologian, you present the challenge for us as to what does this mean? Because surely it can't mean living with paradox, can't simply mean with settling for untidy incoherence and nothing more. Surely it must suggest that being Catholic theologian in relation to lived Catholicism is about living within a space defined by multiple differing parameters of concern and the close work that's required there, about recognizing that we live within different partial truths in relation to differing partial truths, which need to be held together in communion if we are to live according to the whole as Catholos, as Catholic. It's suggestive for me of the task of the theologian in relation to lived Catholicism as being one of requiring graced, patient attentiveness, of requiring graced discerning in relation to the particulars, and of requiring deliberate, intentional, creative action that is born from that. Massimo and Avril, blessed are you, and thank you so much for what you opened for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Massimo. That was just wonderful. I mean, my brain is exploding with ideas now. And we finished our last conference by saying, where are the theologians? You know, how do we get the theologians to come and talk with us? And we've just started with just a brilliant way of getting that conversation. That circles back to last year to me and just gives us a rocket boost forward. So thank you so much. So now we need to have a coffee. We need to take 5 minutes, and we are going to go into 4 different streams. And we're going to hear about the granular experience on the ground of what it means to hold this paradox and the prophetic intention. So you will find the streams, you will find the abstracts of the papers back in the program, and you'll find the links on that password protected site, and you can just find your way there. If you get lost, come back here and we will direct you to the right place. Enjoy the break. Thank you very much again. A very warm virtual round of applause from everybody. The weirdest thing.